It was an ordinary afternoon on a quiet street, until it wasn't. An elderly woman, frail but determined, shuffled toward a commotion at the edge of the park. A police officer, stern and imposing, towered over a young man whose fear was written all over his face. Tensions were high, and it was clear that the situation was about to escalate. The officer's sharp tone cut through the air, his words laced with prejudice that made onlookers uncomfortable but too afraid to intervene. Yet, amidst the growing unease, the elderly woman did something no one expected. Slowly, she knelt on the ground in front of the officer. The crowd fell silent, their breath caught in collective anticipation. What was she doing? Why was she kneeling? And then, as the officer froze, something utterly shocking happened, leaving everyone questioning what they thought they knew about courage, humanity, and justice. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the elderly woman, her hands trembling slightly, looked up at the officer with eyes full of something no one could quite read. Was it defiance, sorrow, or perhaps both? The officer shifted uncomfortably, his rigid posture faltering as her unexpected action caught him off guard. Behind her, whispers rippled through the gathering onlookers. Some recognized her as Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, a retired teacher known for her quiet life and kind heart. But why was she here? And why had she taken such a bold step? The young man at the center of the confrontation glanced nervously between the officer and Mrs. Hayes. His hands were still raised, his body tense with the weight of the moment. "I've seen enough," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with an unmistakable authority. "This ends today." The crowd held its breath, unsure of what might come next. Mrs. Hayes didn't rise from the ground. Instead, she held her position, her gaze locked on the officer. The crowd, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent, seemed frozen in time. The officer's expression hardened, his authority clearly challenged, but beneath the surface there was hesitation. "Ma'am, please step back," he finally said, his voice less commanding now, almost uncertain, but she didn't move. Instead, she began to speak, her voice steady but layered with years of wisdom and pain. "Officer," she said, "I've lived long enough to know what fear looks like. It's in his eyes, just like it was in so many of my students' eyes decades ago. I've seen what happens when fear wins." The young man glanced at Mrs. Hayes, his breathing heavy, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't sure if she was making things better or worse, but her words seemed to echo through the tense air, unraveling something deeper. The officer took a step back, his hand hovering near his radio, unsure whether to escalate or stand down. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every person in the crowd felt it, a clash of power, fear, and something unspoken that Mrs. Hayes seemed to carry with her. "Do you think this is strength?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "Pointing a badge, a gun, or your authority at someone who's already hurting. Strength isn't about control, it's about compassion." Her words struck a nerve, not just with the officer but with everyone watching. The young man, his chest rising and falling rapidly, couldn't hold back anymore. "You don't know what it's like," he blurted out, his voice breaking. "You don't know what it's like to be judged for something you can't change." The officer's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, remorse, doubt. The crowd inched closer, the lines between bystanders and participants beginning to blur. Everyone was waiting for the moment when the fragile balance would break, but no one could predict which way it would fall. Before the officer could respond, a voice from the crowd broke through the tense silence. "Eleanor." It was a man in his late 50s, his face lined with recognition and unease. He stepped forward, his uniform different, a retired officer, judging by the faded badge pinned to his jacket. Mrs. Hayes turned to him, her expression softening just slightly. "David," she said, her voice tinged with both familiarity and regret. The crowd watched as the two exchanged a look that suggested a shared history, one that had suddenly become part of this moment. "I didn't think I'd see you like this," David said, glancing between her and the younger officer. But you haven't changed, still stepping in when no one else will. The younger officer, visibly confused, looked to David for guidance. Do you know her? He asked cautiously. David hesitated before nodding. She stood up for me once, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. When I was in his shoes. He gestured toward the young man, his words sending a ripple through the crowd. Mrs. Hayes held her ground, her gaze unwavering. And you know how that story ended, don't you, David? She said, her voice suddenly sharp. The weight of her words hung in the air, leaving everyone braced for what was about to unfold. David sighed deeply, the weight of his own memories evident in his expression. It ended because someone finally listened, he said, turning to the younger officer. I was scared, just like him. I was judged just like him. But one person, a teacher who refused to look the other way, changed everything. The officer's gaze shifted uneasily between David, Mrs. Hayes, and the young man. The crowd murmured, their whispers growing louder as tension reached its peak. Mrs. Hayes, still kneeling, placed a hand on the ground, as if to steady herself. You have the power to make a different choice, she said softly. Right here, right now. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then the officer slowly lowered his hand from his radio. He exhaled sharply and stepped back. Go home, he said to the young man, his voice quieter now. This ends here. Relief swept through the crowd, but before anyone could move, the young man turned to Mrs. Hayes, his voice trembling. Why did you do this for me? He asked. She smiled faintly. Because someone once did it for me, she replied. The words hung in the air, revealing a connection no one had expected. The twist wasn't in what had happened, but in what it had revealed, a shared history of struggle, courage, and the belief that even in the darkest moments, humanity can shine through. As the crowd began to disperse, the weight of the moment lingered in the air. The young man gave Mrs. Hayes a grateful look, his voice steady but full of emotion. Thank you, he said, his eyes glistening. She simply nodded, her smile warm but knowing, as if to say the fight was never truly over. The officer stood silently, watching the scene unfold. David placed a hand on his shoulder, speaking quietly. You did the right thing today. Don't forget how it feels to choose compassion over control. The officer didn't respond, but his expression softened as he looked at Mrs. Hayes one last time. As the young man walked away, Mrs. Hayes stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. She turned to David with a small smile. Funny how history has a way of repeating itself, she said. David nodded, but this time it ended differently.